Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. So thank you all for joining us. The webinar today is Accessibility and Inclusion, Why It Matters and What You Can Do. We're excited to have a terrific panel for you today. My name is Scott Lipinski. I'm the Director of Student Accessibility Services here at UNH, and I will be moderating. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. So if you do have questions, we encourage you to ask your questions. Please put those questions in the Q&A section. You'll find the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to put questions in there. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction. We'll, of course, introduce the panelists as well. We have some prepared questions, but we have plenty of time for your questions too. So please feel free to use that Q&A section and add those questions. So before we dive in, we did want to provide an overview of the topic and kind of why we're here today. So as you can see from the title, we're really focusing on accessibility today. And accessibility is a really big topic. You can spend a whole career on it. Many of us do. So we're not going to be able to get to everything, but what we really hope is to emphasize accessibility is something that we can all do, right? And ultimately we can all benefit from. Accessibility is a little tricky to define. There's many definitions and most of them tend to be something like accessibility is when things are accessible. So it can be a little tricky to define, but one good definition can be taken from the Department of Justice and Department of Education letter around accessible ebooks. It's from 2010. It's a little older now, but I kind of liked the summary of where it gets to. So something is considered accessible if it allows for individuals to independently, and this is the part from the letter, so independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services. And that's really important because the intended outcomes of that are very clear, right? So when something is accessible, it allows for all individuals, including people with disabilities, to participate and contribute equitably. So when we think about what accessibility is, it really does involve change. It involves changing kind of how we understand the people we work with and how we understand our work itself. So when we think about who we work with, it involves anticipating needs, of the people you work with, right? That could be clients, it could be colleagues, it could be students, right? Anyone you might work with. And part of the focus is absolutely on people with disabilities, but ultimately, all people benefit from more effective and supportive environments. And when you're creating accessible environments, that's exactly what you're doing, right? You're creating more effective environments. So it also helps us understand our work itself, though. So when we're thinking about kind of, a learning environment, workplace, the materials we're creating, a website, whatever that might be, accessibility allows us to look at our work in new and exciting ways, right? So as we're thinking about those needs and thinking about what else people might benefit from, what are those potential barriers that they might be facing, we're looking at things we haven't looked at before, right? So there might be things that we previously missed, or there might be things that we come up with about engaging audiences in new and exciting ways. So really, when we're talking about accessibility and the benefits, right? Benefits are really far-reaching. It's not just people with disabilities that benefit from accessibility, but as we'll discuss today, it's really a critical consideration across the board. It's a critical consideration for everyone, whether there are specific disabilities or not. So hopefully that's a good brief introduction to what we're going to talk about, and we'll go into depth, of course, on a lot more of these things. So before we dive into the prepared questions, we do want to introduce our panelists. I will get started. So I'm not only moderating, but I'll be contributing as well. My name is Scott Lipinski. I am the Director of Student Accessibility Services here at UNH. I am not a UNH alumni, but I have been here for 3.5 years. So I've almost been here the length of a undergraduate degree. So I think that counts. So we do lots of work around accessibility on campus, certainly lots of work around making things accessible, helping things become accessible, but a lot of our work revolves around accommodations and working directly with people with disabilities. So I will turn it over to Kelsey for an introduction for her.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm Kelsey, she, her, and I currently work as the head of accessibility for ADP, which is not ADT, the security situation. It's ADP, the payroll HR company, often very confused. But I've worked in many sectors before joining ADP. I worked at McDonald's Corporation, standing up the accessibility team there and their internal user experience team. Before that, I worked for the University of Massachusetts system in assistive technology and accessibility. And part of why I'm here from the alumni perspective is because I did my speech language pathology master's degree and assistive tech certification through the University of New Hampshire. And I previously have worked as a speech language pathologist and a teacher of the deaf as well. So it's great to be here with all of you.
Awesome, thank you. Crystal?
Good afternoon. My name is Crystal Skane. I am a native Minnesotan and completed my undergraduate degree in Minnesota, but moved out here to work with Northeast Passage as a recreation therapist and an adapted sport professional. So I've had the pleasure of working with Northeast Passage for 22 years. It's been an awesome, exciting place to be, and we are part of the College of Health and Human Services within the University of New Hampshire. So as part of my journey here, I also completed my graduate degree in recreation therapy, and it's been a really inclusion and accessibility is a huge part of what I do, both within my role at Northeast Passage, our opportunities within the university, and our individuals in different communities that we work with. So happy to be here.
Awesome. So our first question, so how does accessibility and inclusion contribute to more effective learning and working environments? Why do you feel accessibility should be a critical consideration? So Crystal, we'll get started with you.
Absolutely. Scott, I really liked the part of your definition, how everybody benefits from inclusive environments, and from just taking that moment to really pause and think, am I reaching everyone with this message? Is this information accessible to people in different formats or by different pathways? Am I thinking about how someone who experiences a disability or a disabling condition, how might they participate or take advantage of the services and opportunities that we provide? And I think just taking that pause and asking that question can be the first step in a really effective process for change, and thinking about some of those simple suggestions that can be really, really impactful for someone to achieve their goal through your program, or have the opportunity to participate and experience the outcomes that you're providing those opportunities for. So I think that in a lot of ways, accessibility can be very simple. A lot of it involves inviting a conversation, and how can we build up those skills and tools to start those conversations, invite them in, give people permission to share what might be helpful for them as an accommodation, and how we might work together to make that how we can make that available to folks so that they know those. One, we're thinking about accessibility. We know that that's something that's important. We're inviting that conversation. I think is the first really important step. If we look at the disability statistics of, the current models through the CDC are stating that 1 in 4 adults in our country report having or experiencing a disability or a disabling condition in some way. The most prominent is a mobility impairment. And then we have other considerations with cognition, independent living, hearing, vision. And there are some really, I think those are really, really impactful, empowering statistics. Like 1 in 4 people will benefit from accommodations in some way. And I think that alone, when we're looking at who we're serving, in many ways, we're already working with people with disabilities, but are we providing the most effective learning environment or the most effective means of accessing our information? Can we do better? And how can we start that conversation to be able to make some of those changes?
Yeah, that's great. And one thing as you were talking kind of reminded me too. One of the really important reasons why we think about accessibility, and I'm actually talking to another committee tomorrow about the same thing, is, accessibility is not just a practice, but it's such an important signal because it shows people that their needs are being considered and that people care about them as individuals and that they are seen and that they are understood, and often what winds up happening is if people have to ask for supports, then they're already kind of behind in that, and as you're talking about that kind of like that, it's such an important signal, I feel like, especially with accessibility, that it's not just like, yeah, we created it and that's great. It's when you come to that and you see that it's accessible and you've been considered, it's such an amazing signal that you should be there, that you belong there, that you're part of the community. So I think that's a really important aspect of it.
I'd love to add to that as well. Kelsey speaking. I think the fascinating thing about statistics for me is that I don't even believe them. That sounds terrible. I think it's a really great foundation, but my additional kind of thoughts about statistics are they are skewed when it comes to disability. And that's largely because if you think about it, and kind of my trips around the sun with this, there are many people who have disabilities who don't identify as disabled. So that's one piece as to why the statistics are probably significantly lower than they actually are. Another reason is many people don't know that their disability qualifies. And also just the reality that even though disability is one of the most human aspects of being a human or just a living creature, it's still it has so much shame around it, which is part of what I think Crystal is speaking about and Scott is speaking about, that if we kind of are able to break down some of that societal barrier to just saying I'm disabled, that's just what I am, I think suddenly we would realize that statistic is significantly more. So it's just something that I think about a lot as I work with different people, and even just thinking about many people in the deaf community, especially individuals who are culturally deaf. They often will say they don't consider themselves disabled. So if we're looking at employment data, for example, they're not necessarily always going to check the box. So that means that suddenly our statistics are skewed. So I really love what you said, Scott, too, about not making people have to ask, because half the time many people might not even know that they need something different to be more successful or feel like they belong. And that comes right back to some of those statistics. So 1 in 4 is such an important number, 1 in 7 worldwide, but in reality we can safely say that it's likely significantly more. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's such an important point too, because I know, Kelsey, we had talked about this when we were kind of thinking about the webinar as well, is there's so many other people who not technically having a disability but can benefit. And we talk about this a lot with universal design and all of the benefits to universal design, and captions being a great example of that, of so many people utilize captions that do not technically need them. Like technically you could go without captions and be fine, but like it's so beneficial to so many people. I know I don't technically need them, but they're on all the time when I watch TV because I like them. I think they're great. It makes it easier for me. So there's so many huge benefits beyond just those even 1 in 4 statistics.
Absolutely. Kelsey, I'm so glad you brought up the statistics and that sort of that identity alignment. That is a very contemporary conversation I'm having at our program right now. And it's one of the reasons we changed our tagline a few years ago. Previously it was living beyond disability, and we were having people come to our programs and benefiting from participation or using adaptive equipment and finding those different ways to play. Because, for whatever reason, I can't ride my bike the way that I used to. So rather than give up biking, I'm going to try this recumbent trike, and I'm going to do that really cool thing. And I can still bike, and I'm still a cyclist. But that person does not necessarily identify as having a disability. who cares? That's right. So we kind of have to break down that identity, like it. And Scott, you said this a moment here. It doesn't, whether you identify as having a disability or not, is what would be helpful to you to be able to participate in the things you would like to do and find success. And what does that look like for you? And or how can we help you figure out what that is for you? We are working right now in this country. We have, for the first time ever, more people over the age of 55 than under the age of 5. Like, our population right now is aging. Some refer to that as baby boomers or the silver tsunami. Some people find those terms offensive. So we're going to use people who are aging actively or want to continue being active as they age. And that's one of the really cool trends we're seeing in this profession, is that people are getting older. People with disabilities are also getting older. And what are the impacts of aging on outdoor recreation or trending? Turns out there's not a ton of information because people haven't lived this long and gotten this old. And it's some really cool opportunities for information. But what we're finding is that there's a gap between people who are aging and experiencing disabling conditions due to the natural course of aging, may not necessarily identify as having a disability. And that's okay. There's that, where does this nexus of disability identity and the natural aging process, where do those intersect? And I think we're going to see some really cool research and conversations about this in the coming years. But there are, people who are aging are being encouraged to stay active, to stay engaged in outdoor recreation, and they're wanting to do those things. So I think that's really a cool opportunity for my profession in particular, where we're talking about access to outdoor recreation or inclusion in the adaptive sport participation. How can we break down that disability misconception to create opportunities to play, to stay active, to stay healthy, to stay engaged in your communities? And that's a really contemporary conversation right now in my profession. So I'm so glad you brought it up.
And I think it's such a good point too about the people don't always identify with it. And when you were saying that, especially around the aging population, I will admit I went immediately to my father, who refuses to acknowledge that his hearing is not what it used to be. And he now subtly talks about captions quite a bit, of like, oh, you don't have those on anymore. And like, interesting. Like, okay, like, but for him, it's part of, as you said, staying active and being able to do the things that he's done, and being able to keep up. And yeah, it's such an important point of, you might not identify as that, but still benefit from it. That's great. Jumping into our next question. So for someone brand new, so certainly there could be people on the webinar who are just new to accessibility. Maybe they've just started kind of reading about it, hearing about it, whatever it might be. What is one thing you would recommend for how they can get started? So I'll get things started for this one. So one thing I would recommend, I will shamelessly plug a new resource that we have at UNH. So we took a lot of time to create a new resource called Accessible UNH. So Accessible UNH is, to us, a really great place to start, because this is often the kind of question we get of people are like, I'm really excited, this sounds really good, what do I do? Like, where do I start? So what that resource does is go through a little bit more of like Accessibility 101. You've never heard of it before, where do you start? Disability 101, right? You have no idea what disability is. Great, like, good place to start. It goes through a lot more of the digital kind of accessibility thing. So more of what does accessibility look like in a digital space, which transitions into where I think is a great place to get started around accessibility. Things like accessible Word documents. Microsoft Word is a great place to get started if you've never started there before. If you've never created an accessible document, lots of really good things you can put into that, lots of really good tools to kind of check things and make sure everything is going well. But I always say start with the basics, like go back to kind of those essentials. So kind of going down the kind of logic trail, right? So start with accessible UNH, learn more about it, jump into a document and start thinking about a document. You have to even go even more narrow than that, think about headings. How do you make an accessible heading, right? Part of why I always try to go more narrow with my guidance is there's no wrong place to start with accessibility, because if you are being more accessible, that's a win, right? Like there is no like perfect state of accessibility that we reach that suddenly we get there and there's this nirvana where we never have to think about accessibility again, right? We're constantly thinking about accessibility, right? So where you start isn't as important as getting started. So if you want to start with accessible UNH, if you want to start with a Word document, whatever that might be, all good places to start, because wherever you start is going to be a wonderful place to begin.
I'd love to add to that. One of the first things, if you're sitting here and you're like, this is all new to me, I highly recommend watching the late Stella Young's TED Talk, I'm Not Your Inspiration, to really help set a foundation for how to think about disability, and to hear from someone. Sadly, she passed away a few years back, which is a huge hit to the community, but she lives on in legacy in so many ways. But that talk really helps understand from a disability perspective many of the behaviors and ways that people can unintentionally and unknowingly harm disabled people in conversation or in how they interact on social media. And so knowing that we all frequently talk to other people, engage with other people, and use social media, that can be a great place to start to kind of set expectation. Another great tool to kind of understand, as we're all working on unpacking different biases, Harvard's implicit bias assessment tool. They have many of them, so take any of them. But there's one on disability, and it's just really fascinating. So if you like to think about the science of our brain and how we think about things knowingly, unknowingly, partially knowingly, it can be really telling. And you'll often find that even as someone who may be deeply ingrained in disability, you will have bias in disability. I probably have bias more on physical disability because I am less engaged with physical disability, like the physical world, and making that accessible versus digital accessibility, which I'm frequently engaged in. I do caregiving for a parent and support a parent. So there are some aspects of physical accessibility, but you start to realize and unpack certain things where you're like, I haven't thought about, or I don't think about certain aspects of disability as often. Another thing that I would highly recommend right now as we enter the holiday season, where are you holding your event? How accessible is that? Do you have food options for people that are inclusive? The spaces where people are accessing the bathroom, is that an accessible space? Do you need to be concerned about fragrances? Do you need a quiet space for people? Really starting to understand your family or your friends or your community and what their needs might be can just make the holidays so much better for many people who frequently have to kind of just get through them. So that's some other great places to start that has very real impact right now.
I would love to add another resource, Kelsey. I'm so glad you brought up Stella's Young in the objectification of people with disabilities as objects of inspiration. I absolutely love her TEDx talk from Sydney. I think 2014 was the year that was. Highly recommend everyone on this webinar watch it, because there are all unconscious bias that we have and can take a little bit of time to unpack, learn a little bit more about it, and see how it is displayed even today. There's another great YouTube video that's called Models of Disability that is put forth by Bethel University. Kelsey, I see you nodding your head. It's about 10 minutes long, but it's put forth as part of the social and behavioral sciences at Bethel University. And in this 10 minutes, this professor unpacks 6 different models of disability or ways that we might think about disability. And it's really, really well done, very digestible, and highlights the moral model, the medical model, the social model, functional and rehabilitation model, the cultural model, and the psychological model. And I just find it really interesting to take a moment, take a pause, and see if there's any bias that you might unpack as part of that little bit of research. I think that is a great first step too. Like, what is it that I might be thinking that I don't realize I'm thinking, and how can I change that?
I think that's great. And what it was reminding me as well is how those biases get enacted in what people talk about as very unintentional barriers. You know, that we talk about them a lot at UNH and kind of how we're thinking about education and teaching. And what I always go back to is some of that very unintentional barriers is, so my background was in education and elementary education in particular, and every elementary educator makes the same mistake when they start, same one. And it's all about unintentional barriers. They have a vocabulary lesson that they're going to teach, and they're like, we're really excited. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut out the words for the vocabulary that they're then going to match with the definitions. Any early elementary teacher knows, like, that is a mess. You are setting yourself up for the biggest failed lesson, because some students are going to start cutting things out and they're going to be awesome and done and everything's matched up and they're done in 5 minutes. Others will be like, I miscut this letter slightly and I don't know what to do now. And you're like, just put it together, but they can't get there. There's others who will just, their fine motor skills are just not there, so they're never going to cut them out. So part of it is you've created this really unintentional barrier of cutting out words before you get to the actual meat of what you're kind of looking at. And I think a lot of our bias shows up in some of those very unintentional ways, so we limit the way people participate because we think that is the way they should participate, and part of looking at that bias and looking at what that means is thinking about, like, how does that play out in what I'm designing? How does that play out in my event? Kelsey, I love your idea of thinking about like a holiday party, right? Of like, what am I assuming people will be able to do at this party? How am I assuming that they'll do that? And have I created unintentional barriers? So if, for instance, it's in a location that doesn't have a lot of accessible parking, well, what if somebody needs accessible parking? What am I bringing out kind of unintentionally, and how are those biases potentially showing up? I think is a really important way to start looking at that as well.
I think it's a opportunity to, this reminds me of another conversation of, yes, we're thinking about the holiday party and can everyone access and enjoy the space and experience all the equitable outcomes, right? Is there opportunity for that? There's another side of that conversation that may have conflict, for instance, with outdoor recreation and access. There's a misconception that we want to pave the wilderness or create this uber accessible standard. And I think there's misconceptions there too, in terms of what is accessibility in terms of outdoor recreation programming. So if you're looking at, what are we as an organization, and what components of our program have accessibility measures, and what do those look like? How are we communicating those so that people can make their own assessments of, is this trail going to be good for me? Or is this specific event that has this duration over this terrain the right one for me? Is this helping meet my goals? And having that just right level of challenge. So it's having that menu of opportunities in many cases with the information disclosed so people can make that self-selection as, yes, this I think would work for me, or this would be a good challenge. Whereas other people will do different things with that information. So I think it's having that variety, but really putting the information out there so people can make their own choices.
I think that's great. And I think it speaks to that independence piece that's so critical with accessibility, that, it's never about doing something for someone. It's helping them do it themselves, and I think that's a really, really critical piece. And it's a great example from the outdoor recreation fields. Thank you. And so when we're kind of moving now to a bigger sphere, so in your opinion, what actionable steps can individuals or organizations take to promote accessibility and inclusion? And Crystal, I believe we're starting with you.
I think having a statement that is findable in your materials is helpful, that says, hey, we want to have a conversation about this. Please, the door is open. Let us know if we can help. That might sound like, we strive to host inclusive, accessible events that enable all individuals to engage fully. To request an accommodation or for inquiries about accessibility, please contact da-da-da-da-da-da. That might be a statement you would have on some of your information or your website or your materials if you're hosting an event. Every single person is going to be different and may not know what their needs are. So just saying, hey, we'd love to have a conversation. We would love to be able to see how this can work. And then be thinking about, what are some of the accommodations we may make for someone who has low vision or has difficulty hearing, maybe has a mobility impairment or uses a mobility device of some means. How would someone who uses a technology device for assisting with communication participate in this event? And how can that be helpful? How might we utilize that as part of our communications? How, if someone is bringing a service animal, are there any implications for participating in a program for that service animal? And how is that invited? And you brought up, Kelsey, the components of allergies or sensitivities or other individual components as well. So just kind of thinking like, how might we work together? And how might we think in advance of having some materials in larger text? Or how might we utilize a communication device and practice being patient with communications? I think so many people have invisible disabilities that, when we think about disabilities, and this is a statistic, Kelsey, of all the people, there's probably only about 15% who have a visible disability. Someone who might walk differently or use a visible mobility device. So many people have more invisible disabilities, maybe a brain injury or some other component of chronic health that is invisible. And in those instances, it's extra important to be able to invite those conversations and say, hey, what can be helpful to you?
I definitely would love to add to that, because I think this conversation goes really well with a few of the questions asked in the chat. So I think we can probably answer them a little bit live here. But lots of questions about how do we make events more accessible? And can that be shared after the webinar? So I'm hoping we can share some of the resources from the chat to participants, but I did share to everyone in the chat a link to Autistic Advocacy. They have an incredible checklist that goes across physical, sensory, and cognitive things to consider when you're planning a physical, in-person, hybrid, or virtual event. Definitely recommend checking that out. And I think in advance is the key thing here. The more we can be proactive to needs versus reactive, I think the better off we'll be, the more welcoming we'll be. Again, it helps everyone. I know one of the questions here was more specific about hearing. And although individuals who experience hearing disabilities may or may not need certain supports or accommodations or anything during a live, hybrid, or in-person event, there are many other types of disabilities that can either benefit from the same things that person might need and other things. So I encourage you to think more broadly about the experiences someone might have. So I'll back up and say, there's a lot of really interesting research coming out of the Inclusive Design Center at the University of Toronto focused on rethinking the 80-20 principle. So instead, I encourage us to not think about the 80% and to think about the 20%, and that's going to make the 80% benefit. So this is a great example of that. If you've got, more people who experience hearing loss or hearing disabilities attending your event, let's also think about additional people in that 20%. So, and I will say from the hearing perspective, there are many different types of individuals with hearing disabilities. So some people do use sign language, some people don't. Some people prefer CART services, the real-time captioning supports. Some people prefer preferential seating and close to a speaker. So there's a lot of variability, which goes back to what you were saying, Crystal, about ask. Let's not assume. And you may also find that if you have a presenter who's a part of the event with a disability, that it's really important to make sure that the accommodations or the supports that they have or are requesting are in place and that they meet their specific needs. When I'm talking about an interpreter right now, I'm thinking not all interpreters are created alike. Not all interpreters are representative of the deaf community. So allowing people to choose the interpreter that supports them best is ideal. Yeah, so just adding some of those pieces on.
Yeah, that's great. And I think part of what I would add when I think about kind of making those practices stick at an organizational level, I know we talk about this a lot at UNH, and we're making progress, we're getting there. But really the biggest goal for me is always accessibility shouldn't be optional, right? Accessibility is not an opt-in kind of thing. It's what we do. It's an expectation. A great example of this is like video processes, right? So oftentimes people create a video, they'll create it in the way they want to create it. They'll get to the end of it and then they'll say, okay, so I just need to put on captions and I should be all set. You're like, well, did you think about color? Did you think about pacing? Did you think about timing? There's lots of things that you need to think about. And yes, captions are important and good and we need them, but have you thought about that ahead of time? Have you gotten us there beforehand, right? So captions are not something that at the end should just be placed on and say, oh, we got them, we're all set. But did you plan for that, right? Is that in your timeline of actually creating that video? So often where, we'll look at, when people create a video and they'll have all of their timelines, it'll be really great, it'll look really good. And then you'll sort of say, okay, well, where are captions in this timeline? Well, they're right. We'll do that once we're done with the video. And you're like, but you're not done with the video until it has captions. Like, it's not an opt-in. Like, you have to have the captions there. So why is that not in your timeline? And usually we get to that end stage and they're like, well, but captions are going to take another 2 days, 3 days, week, whatever it is. And like, we didn't plan that in. So now we have to delay. And like, well, that should be part of your timeline. It should be part of what you do. So I really always try to emphasize that piece of, it's not optional, right? So especially in an organizational level, putting forward that messaging early on, that this is what people are responsible for. This is what we all are responsible for. We don't all have to be experts in accessibility to do it, that we all can make huge progress and make really good strides. But it's a part of what we do, it's the decision making. The other example I would use there is procurement. So often we'll have this issue where someone will, want to buy this really great product. It meets every need that they think it will meet. And you go, great, what about accessibility? Right, what about accessibility? Like, was that included in the process? And part of the problem is, if you don't think about that ahead of time, you may buy something and it's not usable for a certain percentage of the population you hope to reach, which is really problematic if you hope to reach everyone. If you hope to have the widest possible audience and you have inaccessible things, you're already cutting yourself out of the market for a big portion of the people. So it is not wise to cut yourself out of the market. You want to reach as many people as you can, so accessibility shouldn't be an opt-in. It's not optional. This is what we do. This is how we do it. And then how do you build that into policies? How do you build that into practices? How do you build that into onboarding? How do you build that into trainings and developments, into milestones, into community events, into all of those things to make it really visible. But it shouldn't be opt-in. So that's always the one that I like to share. So, well, we had one last prepared question, and I know we've already answered some of the questions in the Q&A, it sounds like. So can you provide some examples of accessibility in action, and who can benefit from the accessible practices, and how can we make them scalable? I know we've touched on this a little bit as well, but perhaps some more examples.
Absolutely. I think we've definitely talked about who can benefit for sure. And I just want to reiterate, in thinking about the who for all of this, that's really the most important, to always kind of center the who. And just a reminder that we're not only designing for current us, we're also designing and building physical and digital spaces for future us. So we all kind of have stake in this, right? Whether you have a disability today or not doesn't mean that you will or won't tomorrow. So it's just really something to think about where it benefits everyone. And I really think about accessibility as an iceberg. This is how I frequently talk about it. I also talk about accessibility as a critical aspect of the systems. I think I'm used to hearing, and I grew up in the age of hearing accessibility coupled with sustainability, but I'm not sure that I believe that fully fits. I think it really is a systems approach. I think it more makes sense as how we approach things like security in the digital spaces. It's a part of everything. It's a non-negotiable. You aren't shipping and building a complete product if it's not a part of it, essentially. That's how I view it. And it really is an iceberg. Many organizations kind of only see what's at the top, what's kind of poking out of the water, meaning perhaps, someone has a complaint or a frustration about something. That's what you see, but you don't see all of the things underneath that filter into why that happened. So number one, across every organization I've worked in, attitudes and behaviors are the biggest thing to change. Accessibility is change management at its core, and it's change management across the system. So when we think about scalability, when I started at ADP, for example, the biggest thing is understanding who are your stakeholders, who are the key people that you got to saddle up to, write them down, figure out who those people are. I usually start with procurement, always. And I start with procurement because it helps me understand our landscape. It helps me understand what's currently coming into our organization that's technically, quote unquote, out of our hands right now. And how do we help make that in our hands? How can we impact change scalably? How can we help others come along for the journey and simultaneously ensure that things that we are purchasing are either accessible or on their way? I'm not one for kind of poo-pooing anyone who isn't perfect, because that doesn't exist in this space. So I am more concerned about whether they're on their journey and are willing to learn and grow alongside myself and others. So that's a really big piece too. If you haven't really looked at your procurement process, what's going on there? How are you vetting before you get? And I think too, training, that's a massive one. I've luckily been a part of organizations that have had enterprise-wide training platforms, and I will always push for that, because if nothing else, it becomes a database of learning, an easy place to go to type in questions and get information. On the flip side of this, outside of more the policy, the procurement systems oriented, like wide sweeping things, there's also the community side of this. We're all a part of a community in some regard, friends, family, neighborhood, etc. Start talking about accessibility and disability. Ask questions. You don't have to know everything about it. You can just put it out there and see what you get. You can start to shape how people think about this. And I think, whether people have permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, situational disabilities, transient disabilities, we all have stake in this. So the more we can normalize it in conversation, the more that filters in so many of our spaces. Talk about it at your dinner table or in your schools. I think that's a really important thing. I saw some questions in the chat actually even about how do I, talk about, or how do I meet the needs of individuals with disabilities who maybe don't have self-advocacy skills? One of the first things that I always did in terms of access or disability inclusion when I was working as a speech pathologist is listen. Listen to the students, listen to the kids, listen to the teenagers, find out what they need and honor who they are, and don't try to make them someone else. I think that's the greatest disservice that we can do. It definitely impacts self-esteem. So the more we can talk about it, the more we can listen, we can understand frustration and understand the need for neurodiversity in our world, the more acceptance builds. And that's how we also build self-esteem. That's how we ensure that people of all ages feel like they belong and know they belong. So there's so many different ways to do this. But I really think that accessibility just inherently is the greatest group project. So we're not all in this alone either. And there's a lot of ways that we can approach this based on, who you are. We talked about some of the things before, like Scott, you brought up, if you're someone who emails every day, well, learn how to make an accessible email. If you're someone who writes Word documents or PowerPoints all day, learn how to do that. One small step is a really large step on the impact of someone who might be receiving that information.
I know as you were talking to it, it reminded me of, I forget where it came from at this point, but disability is one of the only identities we'll all share at some point. And I think it's always really a, it's a great way to think through what do we do and how do we do it. I think some examples of what we see, I was thinking about this before, and one really great example of accessibility that I won't use the student name, but the student example. There's a student who came to our office asking about accessible books. And we looked into it, we started looking into it, and this student had already been here for a year. We're like, this doesn't make sense. The student was legally blind, and he was only now reaching out about accessible books. And we're like, what's going on here? Because taken classes, done really well, amazing student, but we have no knowledge of this student. This doesn't seem right. The reality was the classes before were accessible. He didn't need to talk to Student Accessibility Services because those books were accessible already. All he needed to do was show up and learn like everyone else. And I love that example because we didn't know he needed anything different. And when he reached out, he was like, I didn't know I needed anything different. Like, until I got to this class with inaccessible things, I didn't know this was going to be an issue. So why would I talk to people about accommodations? Because it's already accessible. I can already do this. So why should I have bothered to spend my time talking about my needs when they're already met? So I really love that example because it just shows the power of that. Like, he was able to just show up and do well. It wasn't a question about, well, where should I get my materials? Am I going to get them on time? Are they going to be in the format that I like them? Are they going to work with my screen reader? He just learned. That was it. So for that first year, until he got to this class that had inaccessible PDFs, it wasn't a need. It was just, he used it, he accessed it, and it worked. So I know I always really liked that. I was thinking about that before the webinar as well, because I really like that example. Because when it works well, right? You just show up and you get what you need. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to go to next steps. You don't have to think about, oh, wait, I couldn't get that. Now who do I contact? And where do I get an accessible version? You just get what you need. So I always like that example.
It's a good one. And I mean, someone actually just asked in the chat too, I'm going to answer this one live. Do you have any advice on how to deal with leaders in your organization or group that might say, takes too much money, to address these needs, cost is too high, resources offered are not enough? I will say, as someone who's worked in many places, the cost is higher for a lawsuit. And the impact to your brand is far more significant. So I mean, I put a link in the chat to some of the work I referenced earlier from Yuta Trevanius. She's phenomenal, but she runs the Inclusive Design Center in Toronto. And she also is one of the key people who was ingrained in some of the working groups for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are really the international standard for digital accessibility that comes out of the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the governing body of the web. And she did an incredible she's done incredible research on the 80-20 principle. And I think as someone who also has their MBA, who literally got their MBA just because I was so frustrated, I wanted to know what people were learning. I think the 80-20 principle and the history of that, and much of what you learn from Judith in that article and just in general, has been wildly misapplied to business. And so many of our leaders in large organizations, small organizations, wherever, have been working off of archaic information that no longer applies to the world today. Just as an FYI, the 80-20 principle was kind of like misapplied from land ownership in the 1800s in Italy. Does not apply today. So I think there's a layer of helping educate leadership and saying maybe how we're approaching things actually isn't the best for competitive advantage. Perhaps as the world transitions, as disability is an experience that many are having, perhaps accessibility is a set apart, and perhaps we should be leaning into that from a competitive standpoint, from a brand acknowledgement standpoint, something that sets you apart. I would take that angle, and I would also be really, really, really focused on ensuring that people at my organization with disabilities who are comfortable speaking about their experiences start speaking up, and those opportunities are given to them, as well as bringing people in from the outside. I know Justin is on the call. He's a great person to bring into your organization to talk about their experiences. So there's many ways to do that, but I'm a huge fan of leaning into research, leaning into data and information, and applying it to current day, not leaning on information that's very old from the 18 and early 1900s. I said it, 1900s. Anyway, yeah.
I would also add to that too. I mean, one of the angles we've taken is remediation costs an awful lot of time and energy. Remediation is not fun. You know, it's when you plan something and you like it and it's working really well and you find out that it doesn't work, leaders don't like that. At least the good ones don't. They're often like, well, why didn't we think of this? Why didn't we plan for this? So one of the great things I find about accessibility and kind of universal design and those ideas is that it's kind of based off of this assumption that we can predict some of this variability ahead of time. We know that people are different. We know that diversity is real. We're not going to ignore that and pretend that we're going to design something for this magical average person that doesn't exist. So, you know, when I've talked to a lot of leaders and stuff, it's, you know, part of it is, one, you're putting in good principles of practice here. Like you are designing well if you're designing for everyone. But also, like, there's nothing more frustrating than you've designed it and now you have to do it again, or you have to redo it, or, you know, now you have to have, I actually saw this happen once where it was a past university I was at. They bought this really great product that was not accessible. And now they're like, do we break the contract with these people? Like, it wasn't in the initial agreement. So do we just eat the costs and not use it? Do we have to buy something new? Like, what do we do now? Because we didn't express our commitment to this ahead of time. Now we have to change everything. So I think oftentimes, you know, really good leaders will want to know that ahead of time to say like, yeah, of course, this is critical because we have to consider this ahead of time, you know, and if you consider it ahead of time, the costs are often lower than considering it in remediation. You know, so remediation often costs are higher because it takes more of the analysis and everything. It's not part of that planning process. So it's just more effective to do it ahead of time and build it in. And it's not as costly as people think when you do it that way.
I'm going to use some violent language here. I'm so sorry. I don't know. It's a great analogy though. And I think it does help people kind of like, it takes them aback a little bit, but it's on that idea of whenever I talk about accessibility from a digital standpoint, I talk about the parallel paths we inevitably have to take. Proactive, necessary, reactive, also necessary. However, if we stay in reactive, it's going to start kind of making people experience what I call accessibility fatigue. And that's a dangerous place to walk. Once people hit a wall with accessibility where they feel like they're constantly just experiencing debt from a technical standpoint, they feel like they're constantly losing and that it's never something that they can get ahead of. And so we start to lose interest. And that's a dangerous place as a leader to be having your development teams or your design teams or whoever start losing interest because they feel like they're always behind. That's where the proactive side becomes really critical in how you approach that. And the best analogy that I have is the consideration of, I don't remember where this is from, but I talk a lot about this with another leader. And it's the idea that maybe you're a part of a 2-person picnic. You're headed to, sit on the banks of a river and just enjoy a meal together. And, you're sitting there laughing, enjoying your time. And all of a sudden you see a person coming down, a kid coming down the river, and they're drowning. And you're like, oh my gosh, what is going on? I need to go and save that kid. And you go and you save the kid and you're like, okay, good. Phew, you're about to sit down. And then suddenly another one's coming and another one. And suddenly both of you jumping in the river, trying to save the kid, in the river, trying to save the kid. You're getting tired. It's unsustainable. More and more kids are coming down. One of you suddenly starts walking away. The other one says, where are you going? And they say, I'm going to see why these kids are coming down the river and try to fix that. And that's the clear delineation between reactive and proactive. Yes, it's important to save the kids, but also it's important to ask, why is this happening? And what can we do to stop it? And I think that's something that is really powerful when you're talking about getting ahead and when you're talking about cost. It's very costly. The loss of a life, right, from a river drowning. It's really important instead to say, maybe we need to fix a bridge, right? And then suddenly all of those things are no longer an issue. So we talk a lot about that here as well.
Awesome. And I know we've been answering some questions as we've kind of gone along, which is great because we only have about 3 minutes left. So we are quickly coming to the end. So I want to just, Crystal, Kelsey, do you have any last couple of words you'd want to share with the group?
I'd just like to thank everybody for being here today. I think being present and participating in this conversation is another great starting place. You're recognizing that either this is something you're already passionate about or made you curious. And I'm happy that you joined us today. So thank you very much.
I agree. Thanks for having me, UNH folks. And you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to chat more or have other questions. Yeah, it's great to be here, and thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, everyone. It's been really great. And from all the really great questions, certainly if there are more of these kinds of developments or more questions or more things you're wondering about, we're certainly happy to come back and talk more about it. If you did enjoy the webinar today, so please join us online or for in-person events. So they're listed online at unh.edu/alumni. You could also just Google UNH alumni if you want to find it that way too. So thank you all for coming, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks all.